a shattered cameo, and a legacy worth killing for. Welcome to the Mysterious Casebook. I am your host, Michael. Your comments make this mystery even richer. Where are you watching from? Hearing from you makes every story unforgettable. Let's begin. The morning of the St. Mary Mead Summer Garden. Fate dawned with a deceptive serenity, the kind of crisp, bright day that suggested nothing more sinister than overwatered roses and wasp-stalked lemonade jugs. The vicarage lawns, freshly mown and faintly smelling of cut grass, were already dotted with stalls. Mrs. Bantry was supervising the tombola with military precision, her hat bristling with feathers like a general in full regalia. Miss Hartnell was setting up the cake table, muttering darkly about shop-bought sponge infiltrating her domain. Miss Marple arrived early, her pale blue cardigan matching the soft summer sky, and her eyes, keen behind their gentle twinkle, taking in the scene with unobtrusive curiosity. She carried a basket of handmade lavender sachets, as the vicar's wife had insisted, but she did not linger by her own stall. Instead, she found a shaded seat near the church wall, the perfect vantage point from which to observe the ebb and flow of village life. It was a fete like many before, raffles, gossip, and the scent of fresh scones wafting through the air until a small commotion began at the White Elephant's stall. People turned their heads like a field of sunflowers, tracking light. At the center was Mrs. Edgeworth, the recently widowed lady of Foxglove House, her gloved hands trembling as she held up a small velvet-lined box. Inside was a brooch, a delicate cameo, its surface fractured into a spiderweb of fine lines. Even broken, it was striking, the pale profile of a woman against a deep coral background, framed by an ornate gold setting. Mrs. Edgeworth's voice trembled. "This was my late husband's wedding gift to me. It disappeared from my dressing table nearly a month ago. I never thought I would see it again." The crowd murmured. Mr. Soames, the retired schoolmaster, leaned in to examine it. "Where on earth did you find it?" From behind the stall, young Millie Parsons, cheeks flushed from the attention, stammered, "It was in a box of odds and ends donated for the fete. I thought it was just costume jewelry." A hush settled over the lawn. The theft of a treasured keepsake was one thing, but its reappearance, damaged among jumble sale donations, was something else entirely. Mrs. Bantry arched an eyebrow, clearly calculating the social fallout. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the brooch, the fracture lines like veins on an old leaf. She noted Mrs. Edgeworth's reaction was not just shock, but something more guarded, as though the brooch's return were not entirely welcome. The vicar's wife suggested that perhaps it had been misplaced, but Mrs. Edgeworth shook her head firmly. "I remember locking it in my jewelry case." The lock had been forced. At this, Major Petherick, the fete's master of ceremonies, puffed himself up. "We'll have to call Inspector Craddock. This is no matter for idle speculation." His voice carried the relish of a man who enjoyed a bit of scandal almost as much as his afternoon whiskey. The fete continued, but the atmosphere had changed. Clusters of villagers whispered in low voices, heads bent together like conspirators. Miss Marple, sitting serenely under her patch of shade, listened without appearing to listen. She heard Mrs. Bantry remarks that servants always know more than they say, and Miss Hartnell counters that it's the family one must look to. Later, when the raffle was being drawn, a sudden cry came from the tea tent. Mr. Larch, the solicitor, had collapsed into his chair, his teacup overturned. By the time Miss Marple and several others reached him, it was clear he was beyond help. His skin had turned a mottled, unnatural hue, and the faint scent of almonds lingered in the air. The vicar's wife gasped. Good heavens, poison! Inspector Craddock arrived within the hour, the fete now frozen in a kind of stunned tableau. 2 incidents in one afternoon, a stolen heirloom returned under curious circumstances, and a sudden death. Coincidence, perhaps, but in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple thought. True coincidences were as rare as snow in July. As she walked home that evening, her basket of lavender sachets still half full, Miss Marple reflected on the day's events. The shattered Cameo and the death of Mr. Larch might seem unconnected to most, but to her they were threads fine, delicate threads already weaving themselves into the beginnings of a darker tapestry. By morning, St. Mary Mead had arranged the previous day's shocks into a neat row of opinions, like jars of jam at a harvest fair. The bells of St. Mary tolled softly for matins. The postmistress wound the blinds of the little post office with a snap, and the first customers arrived with letters in their hands and theories on their tongues. Miss Marple, who liked to be early, joined the short queue as unobtrusively as a sparrow alighting on a hedge. Before her, Miss Hartnell, stiff-backed and unbending, spoke to the postmistress in tones that carried without effort. "Cyanide," declared Miss Hartnell as if ordering a money order. "Everyone knows it smells of almonds." That tea tent was a disgrace, wasps everywhere, and a great many people dipping tongs into the sugar as though public utensils were for private fingers. It is the thin end of the wedge. Once you allow laxity with sugar, you invite anarchy. The postmistress, Miss Wren, glanced at Miss Marple with a flicker of apology. "A dreadful business, Miss Marple. Poor Mr. Larch. And Mrs. Edgeworth's brooch, too. I've always said these fates bring trouble. Temptation in piles." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Human nature brings temptation, dear. Fate only display it under bunting." Miss Hartnell snorted, but she softened at the edges. "If you ask me, that Cameo is the heart of it. A wedding gift, was it not? Well then, sentiment is a dangerous commodity. If you want to find a thief, look for affection first. It leads to folly." Miss Marple accepted her stamps, her thoughts moving like a quietly flowing stream. Affection, yes, and pride, and the desire to protect a reputation. She did not say so. She remarked instead upon the fine weather and left the shop with her purchases and a mind full of carefully arranged shelves. By 11, the Blue Boar had assembled its own tribunal. Major Petherick held the corner by the fireplace with the authority of a man who once gave orders in a sand-colored country and did not see why the habit should stop. Mr. Soames, the retired schoolmaster, sat with a glass of ginger beer and an air of scholarly reluctance that concealed keen delight. "It is elementary," announced the Major. Larch was a solicitor. Solicitors have enemies. One of them put something in his cup while the ladies twittered. That is what comes from letting amateurs run a canteen. Mr. Soames folded his long fingers. The vicar's wife is no amateur, nor is Miss Hartnell in matters of authority. More to the point, Mr. Larch selected his own cup, if I observed correctly. He took tea, not lemonade. "Tea can be doctored," said the Major, "and so can character." Larch looked pale for weeks. The man had a carbuncle of worry under his demeanor. The landlord set down a plate of ham sandwiches. He came in last week. Mr. Soames looked as though he'd swallowed a paper knife. Asked for soda water. Had a telegram with him. "A telegram?" Mr. Soames perked up. "From whom?" "Wouldn't say. Paid for the soda and left without finishing it. You see all sorts behind a bar," the landlord added, with the obscure pride of someone who has watched lives unfold in the length of a pint. At the window, Millie Parsons sat with a friend, her young face composed into seriousness. "I did not mean to cause a stir," she said for the second time. The brooch was in a box with old picture frames and a chipped sugar bowl. "How did I know?" Her friend squeezed her hand. "They say Mrs. Edgeworth cried when she saw it." "She did," Millie whispered. "But not the way you expect. More like when someone reads an old letter out loud in front of people." Major Petherick, who had the gift of hearing things said on the other side of a room, drew himself up. "Edgeworth. Foxglove House. The place is all servants and silence since the old man died. If you want trouble, look for a shuttered house and a widow with gloves." Gloves conceal. Mr. Soames flinched at the coarseness. One mustn't leap, Major. Mr. Larch acted for half the parish. The Edgeworth estate among them, no doubt. Wills and mortgages are the village's own Greek tragedies. Chorus by the hedge. Miss Marple, who had stepped in for a small packet of tea cakes for her nephew, paused at the bar with a kind word for the landlord's mother, who liked to sit near the icy clock and tell it what time it was. She neither joined the discussion nor hurried from it. Stillness invites speech. Silence gathers the threads. She walked home by the long route, passing Foxglove House by design. The lodge gates were half open, the hedges newly clipped. On the gravel stood a motor car with London plates and an air of having arrived for reasons other than sunshine. A young man stood by the steps, smoking with the studied insolence of someone who wished to be observed, not caring. Miss Marple recognized him from a distance as Gerald Edgeworth, nephew to the late Mr. Edgeworth, who came down irregularly and did not fit well among hedges. Near him hovered Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper, solid and precise, wiping her hands on an invisible apron. "Her ladyship is resting," Mrs. Finch said to the young man. "And Doctor Haydock says she mustn't be agitated." Gerald flicked ash. "She's always resting. The old boy dies, and the village begins to gnaw like mice in the pantry. Now a solicitor pops off at a tea table. Is there something in the water?" "Sir," said Mrs. Finch, and the syllable contained both reproach and loyalty. She turned, saw Miss Marple at the gate, and straightened. "Good morning, Miss Marple." "Good morning," Miss Marple replied, with a warmth that made even hedges seem sociable. "I brought some lavender for your linen press, Mrs. Finch. It helps with dampness." Mrs. Finch hesitated, then came to the gate. "You are kind. We have so much to think about. The brooch, madam, is quite shaken. She says the fracture is new, that it was whole when it was taken." "Ah," Miss Marple said. "Accidents happen in haste." "Or in anger," Gerald murmured, the cigarette lowering. He regarded Miss Marple with curiosity, as if trying to identify a species of bird with unremarkable plumage. "Were you at the fete, madam?" "I was. A great many people were." She looked at him without blinking. "And did you see any of them, Mr. Edgeworth?" "I arrived as things were winding down. Country gaiety gives me a rash." He smiled without warmth and turned back to the steps. "Send for me if my aunt stirs. I need to speak to her about the London house." Mrs. Finch watched him go. "He is not unkind," she said to Miss Marple, "but he is in a hurry. City people are in a hurry. The air presses them." "Quiet," murmured Miss Marple. "It presses them to conclusions as well." Inspector Craddock made his way methodically through the village that afternoon, a notebook in one hand and a look of practical patience in the other. He interviewed the vicar's wife in her parlour, where the smell of tea still hung like a reproach. "I washed the cups myself," she said, "and I shall wash them again. I cannot think how such a terrible thing could happen." Mr. Larch selected a cup from the second row. He asked for lemon, not milk. "I remember because the spoon fell with a clink, and I laughed at it. Imagine laughing. I shall not laugh for a week." "Sugar?" Craddock asked. He took none. "I am almost certain of it." "Almost," echoed Miss Hartnell, who had planted herself in a chair uninvited. "You cannot be certain of anything at a fete. It is a whirlpool of obligation. That is why I use lists." Craddock suppressed a smile and took down names of those nearest the tea-urn, the cake table, and the sugar basin. He was respectful and thorough, and because he was both, people told him things he could use and a great many he could not. He learned that Mr. Larch had argued quietly with someone by the bandstand 2 days before, that he had been seen reading a letter at the grocer's, and that he had taken off his hat for Mrs. Edgeworth, who rarely noticed hats. He paused at the White Elephant stall, now empty and looking as harmless as a shed after a storm. Millie Parsons showed him the list she had kept in pencil. People put their names next to their donations if they remembered, she explained, nervous but earnest. Sometimes they just left things. Craddock ran a finger down the smudged page. Picture frames, toy soldiers, a brass candlestick, a parcel of lace doilies, a hat pin with a jade bead, and a sugar bowl with a chip. No Cameo, of course. One does not write down what one does not know. Who locked the stall at night? He asked. The vicar's verger, Millie said. He has the keys to everything that has keys. Keys are an illusion, Miss Marple said later to herself, walking home. They comfort the honest and amuse the determined. By late afternoon, the telephone exchange offered its own chorus. The operator, who never pried and always heard, reported in confidence to her sister that a gentleman's voice had said, "It isn't safe," and a lady voice had replied, "It must be done now," and then the line had rung off. From which, the sister concluded, it was either an elopement, an embezzlement, or the ordering of a new rug. At the grocer's, Mrs. Bantry spoke as one dispensing both charity and category. One must consider the motive. Mr. Larch would have known every will, every codicil, every debt, every little letter written before bedtime and repented in the morning. That is not information one keeps without consequence. True, said Dr. Haydock, selecting apples with a frown that was half thought and half habit. But let us place the almonds where they belong. Cyanide does smell so to some, but not always, and marzipan was present in abundance. People smell what they fear. Then what do you fear, Doctor? Mrs. Bantry asked. Patterns, he said, and the wrong sort of quiet. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her window with her knitting and a small map sketched in her mind. The vicarage lawn with its lines of chairs and the tea tent to the left. Mr. Larch approached, careful not to spill. A slice of lemon poised like a small sun on the edge of a saucer. Conversation swirling, hands reaching. The Cameo lifted from its velvet bed, the velvet showing a faint mark where something had pressed too hard. Mrs. Edgeworth's face when she saw it, a privacy invaded in public. It was interesting, Miss Marple thought, that Mr. Larch had been said to take no sugar, and yet several people remembered the clink of tongs. Interesting, too, that Millie had spoken of the brooch as if it had spoken back. Young people sometimes hear objects more clearly than their elders do. They have not yet learned to drown them out with explanations. At 9 o'clock, Inspector Craddock called at Miss Marple's cottage, hat in hand. He was always respectful to her, less out of superstition than experience. I won't keep you long, Miss Marple, he said. The inquest will open tomorrow to adjourn. Dr. Haydock can say little beyond the obvious for now. I would value your impressions. Not conclusions, mind you, just atmospheres. Miss Marple folded her hands. The fete was a stage, Inspector. Someone chose the moment when attention was divided by gaiety. That suggests either courage or familiarity. As for the Cameo, I do not think it returned by chance. Things rarely do. It was sent home to create a scene. A scene to cover another, Craddock said. Perhaps. Or a scene to test someone. People perform at fete. They're on their best behavior, which is to say they're most habitual. You learn more from what is customary than from what is dramatic. He nodded, thoughtful. Mr. Larch's chambers were tidy. His clerk says he was in good spirits last week. He also says Mr. Larch had asked to see Mrs. Edgeworth privately, but no appointment was made. Appointments fail, Miss Marple murmured, but encounters occur. Did he speak to Gerald? Craddock's eyebrows rose. You're quick off the mark. Gerald arrived this morning. Loudly. He says he was in London yesterday and can prove it. Proof is useful, Miss Marple said. It is also a costume. When the inspector had gone, Miss Marple laid aside her knitting. The village had reacted as villages do, with sympathy that divides itself into categories and curiosity that calls itself concern. Beneath it all ran the quiet river of motive, moving under bridges of manners. If the Cameo had been the first ripple, Mr. Larcher's death had been the stone. The widening circles would touch every bank in turn. In the morning, there would be statements and solemnities. Today, there were only people to watch. The vicar's wife, counting cups. Miss Hartnell, counting faults. Mrs. Edgeworth, counting losses. Millie, counting breaths between questions. And perhaps somewhere, someone is counting the hours between one act and the next. Miss Marple decided she would go to the vicarage early with a tray cloth she had foolishly left behind. It is always good to return for something one forgot, she thought. It permits one to look again at what others believe they have already seen. And though cups and saucers might yield their secrets, Miss Marple trusted people more than porcelain. Tea cools do not. Tea is poured. Habits pour themselves. It was people she meant to observe when the day unfolded into investigation, for in St. Mary Mead the china seldom lies, but it cannot tell you why someone's hand trembles when a brooch is named, or why a man who never takes sugar laughs at the clink of tongs. Tomorrow would bring questions. Tonight the village sewed its suppositions into neat patterns and laid them gently on beds. They would not fit by morning. They never do. The morning after the fete broke with a soft, misted light, as if the village were reluctant to show its face after so much talk the day before. St. Mary Mead had the air of a place that had dressed neatly but left its buttons undone. Curtains twitched. Doors opened a fraction before closing again. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp roses. Miss Marple took her tea in the small sitting room, the lace curtains drawn just enough to let her see the lane. The postman made his slow way up the road, his bag heavier than usual. There were 2 letters for her from distant cousins, one circular for a sewing machine repair service, and a pale blue envelope without a return address. It contained nothing but a scrap of newspaper folded twice. The clipping reported an inquest held in another county of sudden death, poisoning suspected, and the verdict open. There was no note, no signature. Miss Marple laid it aside without haste. She had lived too long to assume that messages always announced themselves. Sometimes the quietest knock carried the loudest meaning. Inspector Craddock, for his part, began his day at the vicarage. The tea tent, still standing but now forlorn without bunting, looked like a stage after the actors had gone home. The grass bore the faint scars of yesterday's chairs. A wasp circled the sugar basin, abandoned on a side table. Mrs. Price Ridley, the verger's wife, bustled about with a dishcloth, insisting that all evidence of the fete be removed before the day was out. Craddock watched her a moment before asking if the tent had been locked after the event. Locked and bolted, she said, though anyone with the verger's patience could lift the flap at the side. Not that there would be reason to, unless one fancied a stale sponge. Was anyone in the tent yesterday besides the servers? He asked. She paused in her wiping. Mr. Larch came in once before his tea and had a word with Mrs. Edgeworth. Whispered it was. I was at the far end, slicing seed cake. Craddock made a note, his pencil scratching softly. And did Mrs. Edgeworth seem upset? Mrs. Price Ridley pursed her lips. She seemed like a lady who knows the eyes of the parish are upon her. Which they were. From the tent, Craddock went to the solicitor's office in the High Street. Larch's chambers were modest, 2 rooms above the grocer's shop. His clerk, Mr. Bligh, was a man of pale complexion and precise movements, the sort who sharpened pencils to an identical length. I cannot think why anyone would wish him harm, Mr. Bligh said. He was methodical and discreet. If there was unpleasantness, he did not bring it here. Did he mention Mrs. Edgeworth to you? Craddock asked. Bligh adjusted his spectacles, only that he had hoped to arrange a private consultation. He seemed thoughtful about it. He did not say why. Any unusual correspondence? Craddock's gaze swept the tidy desk. Bligh opened a drawer and produced a sealed envelope. This arrived the morning of the fete, hand-delivered. No return address. Inside was a single sentence, typed neatly. "Meet me by the bandstand before the sun sets." There was no name. Craddock thanked him, pocketing the note. Outside, the high street hummed faintly with village business. At the butcher's, Mrs. Bantry was selecting chops, pausing now and then to drop remarks like crumbs for the birds. "Poisonings are personal," she told the butcher, "and a brooch in a jumble box is practically a confession. The trouble is knowing whose." Meanwhile, Miss Marple paid a call on Mrs. Edgeworth at Foxglove House. The morning mist had thinned and the drive glistened faintly. Mrs. Finch opened the door, her face set in the expression of someone bracing for more questions. "She is receiving only briefly," Mrs. Finch said, but led Miss Marple into a dim drawing-room smelling of lilies and furniture polish. Mrs. Edgeworth was seated by the window, her gloved hands folded on her lap. The shattered Cameo lay on the table beside her in its velvet box. The fracture was even more noticeable in the pale light. "You are kind to call," Mrs. Edgeworth said. Her voice was low and measured. "It has been a trying 2 days." "I imagine so," Miss Marple replied. "It must be painful to have something cherished returned in such a state." Mrs. Edgeworth's eyes flickered to the brooch. It was whole when it was taken. "I cannot think how it came to be broken unless it was dropped. Or perhaps someone wished it to be broken." "Objects carry memories," Miss Marple said gently. "Sometimes people cannot bear to look at them whole." Mrs. Edgeworth studied her a moment, as if weighing whether to continue. "It was given to me by my husband on our wedding day. It was not only a gift, but also a symbol. He had a fondness for cameos and said they were timeless. I suppose that is ironic now." Miss Marple asked if she had spoken with Mr. Larch recently. "Only once in passing," Mrs. Edgeworth said, with a slight hesitation. "He seemed anxious, but Mr. Larch was a man who carried his clients' worries. I assumed it was professional." When Miss Marple took her leave, she glanced back at the drawing-room. Mrs. Edgeworth's gaze had returned to the brooch, her posture unchanged, as though holding herself still might prevent further cracks from appearing. By midday, the village green was a quiet stage once more, but not without its audience. Miss Hartnell and Miss Wren sat on a bench, knitting and gossiping, their voices low, but not low enough to be private. "They say the young Edgeworth nephew is in some sort of financial bother," Miss Wren confided. "City living, racing debts. One hears things." "And yet," Miss Hartnell replied, "it is the quiet ones you must watch. That clerk of Larch's blinks too often. It means he is thinking too much or saying too little." Miss Marple, passing by, smiled at them both as if they had remarked on the weather. She knew such exchanges were the lifeblood of the village's informal intelligence service. Each half-truth, misremembered fact, or overheard whisper was another piece of a puzzle that only the patient could assemble. Later that afternoon, Craddock stopped by Miss Marple's cottage. He showed her the note from Larch's desk. "Bandstand before the sun sets," she read aloud. No name. "How curious." "You think it's significant?" Craddock asked. Miss Marple considered. "It is a public place, yet quiet enough for privacy. The timing is interesting. The fete would be winding down and people would be distracted. A meeting arranged then would be unlikely to draw notice. And the sender." She smiled faintly. "There are people who avoid signing their names, not because they fear discovery, but because they believe the recipient will recognize their hand or their lack of it. The absence becomes its own signature." Craddock nodded, tucking the note away. "And the brooch?" "I believe," Miss Marple said softly, "that it was returned not in remorse, but in calculation. Sometimes one throws a stone in the water to see which ripples reach the shore." They sat in companionable silence for a moment. Outside, the faint sound of a motor car approached, then faded toward the high street. "Tomorrow," Craddock said, rising, I'll speak to Gerald Edgeworth, and perhaps the housekeeper again. Housekeepers, Miss Marple said, often know which rooms have been entered without permission. When he had gone, Miss Marple took out the scrap of newspaper from that morning's post. She placed it beside the note from Larch's desk in her small writing case. One was a whisper from elsewhere, the other a whisper from here. Both, she thought, spoke of meetings that had ended too soon. As evening fell, she went into her garden to deadhead the roses. It was a small, unremarkable task, but it allowed her mind to wander. She thought of the Cameo, its fracture lines spreading from a single point, like a blow struck with precision. She thought of Mr. Larch lifting his cup of tea, his eyes meeting someone's just before the rim touched his lips. She thought of Mrs. Edgeworth's gloved hands and of Gerald's restless stance at the foot of the steps. In the lane, two boys passed, one saying to the other, "She didn't cry at all, not even after." Miss Marple did not turn her head, but her fingers paused on the stem of a rose. Some things were better overheard than asked. The first day's investigations had raised more questions than they answered, which, in Miss Marple's experience, was precisely how such matters began. The truth, when it came, would not be found in the most obvious of places. It never was. Tomorrow would bring new visits, new statements, and, if she was not mistaken, a new piece on the board. For the game was already being played, whether the players admitted it or not. Inspector Craddock began his next morning at Foxglove House, arriving just after breakfast, when the dew still clung to the garden paths and the air carried the faint scent of toast from the kitchens. He had chosen the hour deliberately too early for visitors, but late enough to catch residents unguarded. Mrs. Finch received him with the careful politeness of someone who believed in doors as much as in locks. "Mr. Gerald is in the morning room," she said, her eyes flicking towards the west wing, "though he may tell you he has other engagements." Gerald Edgeworth was, in fact, seated in a low armchair with a cigarette already burning in the ashtray and a copy of the Times folded on the table beside him. He rose as Craddock entered, a flicker of irritation passing across his features. "Inspector, I understand you wish to ask questions again. I've already told the constable I was in London on the day in question. If you need to see my train ticket, I can oblige." Craddock took a seat opposite him. "I would like to establish your movements more precisely. You arrived in the village yesterday morning?" "Yes. My aunt sent for me, quite distressed about her brooch. I'm fond of her, though we've never been close. I thought my presence might be useful." "Useful in what way?" Gerald gave a faint smile. "Comfort. Reassurance. You must understand, Inspector, that the Edgeworth name means something in this part of the country. My uncle guarded it jealously. And Mr. Larch, did you know him well?" "Well enough to nod in the street," Gerald replied. "He handled my uncle's will, I believe. Beyond that, nothing." Craddock leaned forward slightly. "Were you aware he had requested a private meeting with your aunt?" Gerald's smile faltered. "No, I was not. And if I had been, I should have wondered why. My aunt has no business with solicitors beyond the usual household affairs. And yet," Craddock said, "Mr. Larch died the same day your aunt's brooch reappeared broken." Gerald's eyes narrowed. "Are you suggesting the two are connected?" "I am considering possibilities." Gerald stubbed out his cigarette with deliberate precision. "Then consider this, Inspector. I have no use for a broken brooch, nor for the drama it has brought. If you want someone with a motive, I suggest you look among those who enjoy theatrics." Craddock left him his morning paper, meeting Mrs. Finch in the hall. She lowered her voice. "You'll excuse me, sir, but young Mr. Gerald, he is not a man who lingers without reason." Back in the village, Craddock's next stop was the solicitor's clerk, Mr. Bligh. He asked again about visitors to the office in the days before the fete. This time, Bligh mentioned a brief but tense visit from Mrs. Price Ridley, the verger's wife, 2 days earlier. She was agitated, Bligh said, and spoke of a document she wished to see destroyed. Mr. Larch told her firmly that was not possible. Craddock made a note and then headed toward the vicarage to find Mrs. Price Ridley herself. She received him in a tidy sitting room smelling of lavender polish and tea biscuits. "I did see Mr. Larch," she admitted, smoothing her skirt. "It was about a matter entirely unrelated to his death, Inspector. A misunderstanding in a will, nothing more. It was my late uncle's, and I had hoped to avoid embarrassment to the family." Craddock asked if she had been at the tea tent during the critical time. "I was slicing a seed cake, as I told you before. I had no opportunity to meddle with cups or sugar." She bristled at the suggestion, "And as for that brooch, well, I wouldn't wear such a thing if it were given to me." Meanwhile, Miss Marple was moving quietly through her own inquiries. She paid a call on Miss Wren at the post office, bringing a jar of quince jelly as a pretext. Miss Wren, naturally, was full of tidings. They say Mrs. Edgeworth kept that cameo in a locked box because it was part of a set. There's a matching pair of earrings somewhere, though no one's seen them in years. If the brooch is damaged, perhaps the set is no longer worth what it once was. Miss Marple listened, offering the occasional murmur. "And has anyone asked about registered posts lately?" Miss Wren's eyes sharpened. "Now you mention it. The day before the fete, a young lady posted a small parcel to an address in London. No return name, just the initials MP in the sender's corner. Paid in cash." "Interesting," Miss Marple said and took her leave, her mind fitting the detail into the growing picture. That afternoon, the inquest opened briefly at the village hall. Dr. Haydock gave his evidence that Mr. Larch had died of cyanide poisoning, consistent with ingestion through liquid. The coroner adjourned the proceedings for further investigation. The villagers filed out in low conversation, eyes darting from one face to another. Miss Hartnell was heard to say, "The poison could have been in the lemon. I've always suspected lemon. Far too cheerful a fruit." At the back of the hall, Mrs. Bantry whispered to Mrs. Price Ridley, "If it were in the tea itself, half the tent would be gone." No, this was meant for him, and him alone. Miss Marple, seated quietly near the side door, observed the shifting of glances and the tightening of lips when certain names were mentioned. She saw Gerald Edgeworth slip away before the coroner had finished speaking. She saw Mrs. Edgeworth enter with composure, but leave with a faint tremor in her step. And she noticed that Millie Parsons, the girl from the White Elephant stall, seemed oddly subdued, her eyes avoiding the brooch whenever it was mentioned. In the days that followed, suspicion settled most firmly on Gerald. He had an opportunity to arrive unobserved at the fete's end and, according to village whispers, financial troubles. His presence in the village coinciding with the two dramatic events seemed too neat for some to ignore. Yet Miss Marple was not convinced. She had watched Gerald closely during the inquest and seen not the guarded fear of a man hiding guilt, but the restless irritation of someone feeling trapped in a game he did not choose to play. She had also noticed the way Mrs. Price Ridley's hands trembled when Craddock questioned her, and how Millie's answers to even the simplest queries seemed rehearsed. On the third day, Craddock visited Miss Marple at her cottage. He brought with him a list of everyone who had been in or near the tea tent in the 20 minutes before Mr. Larch's death. "Gerald is at the top of most people's list," he admitted, "but the timing is awkward. No one saw him approach Larch's table, and no one recalls him handling a cup." Miss Marple studied the list. "Motive is seldom a straight line, Inspector. Sometimes it loops back on itself. You think we're missing someone?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that we are looking for someone who was in plain sight, but whose presence was so ordinary that no one thought to remark upon it. That is often the best disguise." She handed back the list. "Keep asking about the brooch. The manner of its return will tell you something about the mind of the person we seek. A broken gift can wound more deeply than a theft." When Craddock left, Miss Marple returned to her knitting. The pattern was simple, but she had altered it slightly, just enough to require attention. She thought of it as a reminder. When something familiar changes in the smallest way, it often signals a larger shift beneath. That evening, as the sun dipped low over the thatched roofs, a soft knock came at her door. It was Millie Parsons, twisting her gloves in her hands. "Miss Marple." "I didn't mean any harm," she began. "I only thought, well, it was just a brooch and it turned up in a box." But now people are saying things. Miss Marple guided her to a chair. "Things have a way of saying something themselves, my dear, if we know how to listen. Tell me exactly how the brooch came to you." Millie took a breath. The box was left outside the stall early in the morning before anyone else arrived. There was no note. "I didn't open it until later when we were setting up. The brooch was wrapped in tissue, tucked under the sugar bowl." "The sugar bowl?" Miss Marple repeated softly. "Yes, the chipped one that nobody bought. I thought it was odd, but I didn't think it mattered." "Oh, it matters," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but certain. "And it tells us the person who left it wanted it found, but not too quickly." When Millie had gone, Miss Marple sat in the fading light, her thoughts settling into place like pieces in a drawer. A chipped sugar bowl, a broken cameo, a cup of tea with lemon. The picture was not yet complete, but certain lines were becoming clearer. The first suspect might be obvious to others, but to her the real path would lead elsewhere, and soon, she suspected, another turn in the road was coming. The following morning was bright but brittle, the kind of day when the sun shone with conviction, yet the air still carried a faint chill. Miss Marple, seated at her breakfast table with a neatly boiled egg, reviewed the few notes she had jotted down in her fine, looping hand. She did not, as a rule, keep formal records. Too much of life was in the things people left unsaid, but she sometimes found it useful to write down fragments, the way one might sketch a corner of a room before painting it in full. The items were unconnected to most eyes. A chipped sugar bowl, a broken cameo, a meeting at the bandstand, lemon without sugar, and a gloved hand trembling. But to Miss Marple, each detail had weight, and the pattern was beginning to emerge, however faintly. Inspector Craddock, meanwhile, had set his sights on the chipped sugar bowl. Millie's mention of it had lodged in his mind. He found it still at the White Elephant stall, which now stood deserted behind the church hall. The bowl was a small, rather battered piece of china with a faint floral pattern. The chip on its rim had been smoothed by time, as though handled often after the damage was done. He brought it to Miss Marple that afternoon, carrying it in a brown paper parcel. "You might think I've gone soft," he said as she unwrapped it, "but I can't help wondering why anyone would tuck a valuable brooch into something like this. If they wanted to hide it, there are better places. If they wanted it seen, there are better displays." Miss Marple turned the bowl over in her hands. "Indeed, which tells us the intention was not purely to hide, nor purely to display, but to create a delay. A sugar bowl is ordinary. It invites no rush. People pass it by until they are looking for sugar." "Meaning the brooch was meant to be found at a particular time," Craddock said slowly. "Precisely," Miss Marple agreed. "And that tells us the person who left it knew the rhythms of the fate, when the sugar bowl would be moved, when it might be inspected." Craddock frowned. "That could be anyone on the organizing committee, or someone who asked enough questions to learn the routine," Miss Marple said. The chipped bowl went back into its parcel, and Craddock left to make his rounds. Miss Marple set aside her knitting and walked to the vicarage under the pretext of delivering a jar of her quince jelly to Mrs. Clement. She found the vicar's wife in the kitchen, up to her elbows in washing up. "My dear," Miss Marple said with her usual gentle cheer, "I had the oddest thought about the tea service at the fete. You say Mr. Larch took no sugar. Are you certain?" Mrs. Clement paused, wiping her hands. "Almost certain, but he did take lemon, and I remember that because I had to fetch a fresh slice from the tray. Oh, now that I think of it, he reached for the sugar tongs anyway, as though by habit, then stopped himself. Stopping himself, Miss Marple repeated softly, and yet the clink was heard. Yes, Mrs. Clement said, and I remember because it made me glance at him. He was smiling just faintly at someone across the tent. Do you recall who? Mrs. Clement hesitated. I think it might have been Mrs. Edgeworth. She was standing near the cake table at the time. Miss Marple thanked her and made her way back through the garden, pausing at the hedge to watch a blackbird hop along the lawn. The clink of the tongs was a small thing, but small things, she knew, often concealed large meanings. If Mr. Larch had taken no sugar, why pick up the tongs at all? And why smile, unless the gesture was meant for someone's attention? Later that day, Craddock called to say he had spoken again to Gerald Edgeworth. The young man had been evasive about his time in London, producing a ticket but no witness to place him there at the hour he claimed. Yet Craddock was beginning to doubt his guilt. He's arrogant, yes, and self-absorbed, Craddock admitted, but I can't quite see him fussing over sugar bowls and brooches. His style is more direct. I agree, Miss Marple said, which is why I think we must look again at those who would take a quieter path. That evening, Miss Marple took a slow walk toward the green, passing by the bandstand. The grass still bore faint marks where chairs had been set out for the feet, and a scattering of paper petals from the children's games clung to the damp earth. She stood a moment by the wooden rail, imagining the scene in the fading light of Fete Day. If Mr. Larch had indeed arranged to meet someone here, it would have been a place half hidden, yet close enough to the noise to be overlooked. She spotted something pale caught in the grass. An empty envelope, its flap torn. There was no writing on it save for a faint pencil mark on the inside of figure 3. She slipped it into her pocket. The next morning, she took it to the post office and asked Miss Wren, with casual interest, if anyone had purchased numbered raffle envelopes for private use. Not that I recall, Miss Wren said, but the vicar's verger had a handful left over from the church drawer last month. Gave them to whoever wanted them for odd bits and pieces. Miss Marple thanked her and walked away with a faint smile. Such envelopes were common enough, yet the number could have meaning between two people. A small sign, invisible to others, pointing to a time, a date, or even a step in a plan. By midday, the village was buzzing again, for word had spread that Mrs. Price Ridley had been called to the police station for further questioning. She emerged an hour later, lips pressed thin, declaring to anyone who would listen that the police were grasping at vapors. Miss Hartnell remarked to Miss Marple outside the grocer's, "She's hiding something. People don't go to solicitors about family wills unless there's a reason they wouldn't want it printed in the parish magazine." Miss Marple agreed politely, but inwardly noted the timing. Mrs. Price Ridley had motive enough to avoid Larch's scrutiny if he had refused to amend a will. But whether that was connected to the brooch's return or to the fatal cup of tea was still uncertain. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Miss Marple sat with her knitting and considered her finds. A chipped sugar bowl, the clink of unused tongs, a faint smile, and an empty envelope marked with the number 3. None of these things would trouble most minds for long, yet together they whispered of intention. She remembered something an old school friend had once told her years before. The most dangerous lies are the ones told in the smallest actions. In St. Mary Mead, small actions were everywhere. Pouring tea, moving china, tucking something into a bowl no one would examine until later. Miss Marple was sure now that the brooch had not simply been returned. It had been staged, placed to create a moment of discovery that would distract and confuse, and in that moment, when heads turned, when people exclaimed, other, quieter movements could take place unnoticed. The only question was who had chosen that moment, and for whose benefit. The answer, she suspected, was closer than anyone dared to think. By the next morning, The village air seemed sharper, as though the tension of the past few days had settled into the very wind that moved through the hedgerows. A subtle change had come over the faces. Miss Marple passed on her way to the baker's. People's greetings were still polite, but their eyes measured one another in quick glances, weighing possibilities, storing away observations. St. Mary Mead had entered that peculiar stage in a scandal when neighbours no longer wonder whether someone is guilty. They begin to speculate only on who it must be. Miss Marple herself was thinking not so much of guilt as of opportunity. In her mind's eye she replayed the moment of the brooch's discovery. Mrs. Edgeworth's trembling hands. Millie's wide-eyed insistence that she had not known what it was. The curious way the sugar bowl, so unimportant at first glance, had been mentioned twice by different people. And then there was the clink of the tongs in Mr. Larch's hand. Unused, unnecessary, but noted by more than one observer. She was pulled from her thoughts at the baker's door when she heard voices from within. Mrs. Bantry was in full conversational stride, speaking to Miss Hartnell. Mark my words, there is more to Gerald Edgeworth's arrival than he admits, Mrs. Bantry declared, choosing her currant buns with deliberate care. I've heard he was seen in Market Chipping the evening before the fete. That is not London, my dear. Miss Hartnell pursed her lips. If the young man lies about something so trivial, then it is to hide something much larger. City habits breed city secrets. Miss Marple entered quietly, purchased a small loaf, and listened without appearing to. In her experience, outright denials and too perfect alibis often hid less than the small, unguarded truths that slipped into gossip. Leaving the shop, she took the long way home, which brought her past the police station just as Inspector Craddock was seeing Mrs. Edgeworth out. The widow looked pale, her composure stretched thin. Craddock caught sight of Miss Marple and beckoned her over. She insists she barely knew Mr. Larch beyond legal matters, he said in a low voice once Mrs. Edgeworth was out of earshot. But I have reason to believe they exchanged letters in recent weeks. No sign of them in his office. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Letters can disappear quite quickly if someone fears their contents might be misunderstood or too well understood. Do you think she's hiding something? Miss Marple considered. I think she's hiding more than she realizes. Sometimes people conceal facts not because they are guilty, but because they know the truth will lead to questions they cannot answer without treading on another's privacy. Craddock sighed. I'll keep pressing. And I'm going to speak to that verger. He seems to have had keys to half the fate. That afternoon, Miss Marple had a visit from Millie Parsons. The girl looked as though she had not slept well. They kept asking me about the box, Millie began. I told them everything, but I didn't tell them. Well, there's something else. Miss Marple encouraged her with a gentle smile. Why don't you start at the beginning? Millie twisted her gloves in her lap. 2 days before the fete, I saw Mrs. Price Ridley in the vestry carrying a little parcel wrapped in brown paper. She didn't see me. The shapeless thing, well, it could have been the sugar bowl, though I'm not sure. The next morning I saw her again, talking to Mr. Larch near the church gate. They didn't look pleased to see each other. Miss Marple's eyes softened, though she made no comment. And you didn't mention this to Inspector Craddock? I thought it didn't matter, Millie said quickly. And I don't want to cause trouble. My dear, Miss Marple said gently, in matters such as these, trouble has already arrived. We only choose whether to open the door. When Millie had gone, Miss Marple considered this new piece. If Mrs. Price Ridley had brought the sugar bowl or any parcel resembling it to the fete, the connection to the brooch would have grown stronger. And if she had argued with Mr. Larch, it was possible their quarrel had been about more than a will. That evening, the parish council met in the village hall, ostensibly to discuss the repairs to the church roof. In reality, it served as another occasion for the village to gather, watch, and listen. Miss Marple sat near the back, knitting quietly, while eyes shifted toward those who had been most in question. Mrs. Edgeworth entered Gerald's arm, her chin high despite the whispers. Mrs. When Millie had gone, Miss Marple considered this new piece. If Mrs. Price Ridley had brought the sugar bowl or any parcel resembling it to the fete, the connection to the brooch would have grown stronger, and if she had argued with Mr. Larch, it was possible their quarrel had been about more than a will. That evening, the parish council met in the village hall, ostensibly to discuss the repairs to the church roof. In reality, it served as another occasion for the village to gather, watch, and listen. Miss Marple sat near the back, knitting quietly, while eyes shifted toward those who had been most in question. Mrs. Edgeworth entered Gerald's arm, her chin high despite the whispers. Mrs. Price Ridley arrived late, flustered, her hair untidily pinned. During the interval, Miss Marple positioned herself near the tea-urn where conversations inevitably blossomed. She overheard Gerald speaking sharply to his aunt. "You should have told me if you had dealings with Larch," he said, his voice low but tight. "I told you," Mrs. Edgeworth replied. "It was nothing of consequence." Arrived late, flustered, her hair untidily pinned. During the interval, Miss Marple positioned herself near the tea-urn where conversations inevitably blossomed. She overheard Gerald speaking sharply to his aunt. "You should have told me if you had dealings with Larch," he said, his voice low but tight. "I told you," Mrs. Edgeworth replied. "It was nothing of consequence. And yet here we are," Gerald muttered, "with half the county watching us." At the far side of the room, Mrs. Price Ridley was cornered by Miss Hartnell, who asked, with deceptive sweetness, "Were you at the tea tent the whole time, dear?" Mrs. Price Ridley bristled. "If you must know, I stepped out briefly to fetch a tray from the vestry. Is that now a crime?" Miss Hartnell's expression suggested that, in her view, it might be. By the time the meeting adjourned, tensions had risen noticeably. The walk home through the village lanes felt quieter than usual, as though each person was lost in thoughts they preferred not to share. The following morning, Craddock called on Miss Marple again, this time with a new development. One of my men searched Mr. Larch's desk more thoroughly. Hidden at the back of a drawer was a small envelope empty but with traces of pressed flowers inside. Not much to go on. Miss Marple's eyes lit briefly. "Pressed flowers are often tokens, Inspector. They can carry a meaning understood only by two people." "You think it's connected to the letters?" "I think it may be connected to the person he was meant to meet at the bandstand. A pressed flower could be a signal something to identify the right person or to remind them of a shared confidence." Craddock rubbed his forehead. "So now we have a broken brooch, a chipped sugar bowl, an empty envelope with the number 3 and another with pressed flower dust. And still no clear suspect." Miss Marple smiled, faintly. "Oh, the suspect will come clear. These are not separate items, Inspector. They are all part of one design." By late afternoon, the rumor mill had taken another turn. Word spread that Mrs. Price Ridley had been seen at the jeweller's in Market Chipping 2 weeks before the fete. Some said she'd been asking about the value of antique cameos. Others claimed she was there to sell a pair of earrings. Either way, it was enough to make her the subject of renewed suspicion. Miss Marple, walking past the green that evening, saw Mrs. Price Ridley seated alone on a bench, staring into the distance. She approached quietly. "It has been a trying week," Miss Marple began kindly. Mrs. Price Ridley gave a brittle laugh. "They're making me into a villain, Jane. I wanted no part of any of this." "Then perhaps you should tell me the part you did want." The older woman hesitated, then said, "All I wanted was to keep certain things from coming out. In my uncle's will there were bequests that would have been misunderstood. Larch refused to destroy the record. I thought if I could distract him, perhaps he would relent." Miss Marple's eyes rested on her calmly. "Distraction is a dangerous art, my dear. It often obscures more than you intend." They parted without further words, but Miss Marple's mind was already weaving these confessions into her growing tapestry. Distractions, delays, and small signs meant for certain eyes. Someone had orchestrated all of these with care, and she knew that, before long, there would be another move, the kind of move that would either draw the net tighter or cause it to break entirely. The next morning dawned deceptively peaceful, the sky washed in pale gold, and the air scented faintly with honeysuckle from the hedgerows. To the casual eye, St. Mary Mead seemed its usual self. Cottages neatly kept, milk bottles set by kitchen doors, and the postman's whistle punctuating the quiet. Yet for those who had lived in the village long enough, there was a tension beneath the calm, a sense that the story of the fete was not yet finished. Miss Marple felt it as she took her habitual walk to the grocer's. She greeted Mr. Soames, who was busy dusting the books in his window, and Mrs. Bantry, who was purchasing a pound of flour and a substantial slice of conversation with the grocer's wife. The words she overheard, however, were not of the fete, but of something new, something that made even the practiced gossips lean in closer. "Gone," Mrs. Bantry was saying, her eyes bright. "Vanished from her dressing table, and only this morning noticed missing. You don't suppose?" Miss Marple paused just long enough to hear the grocer's wife reply, "I'm not one to suppose, but that's 2 in as many weeks. First, the brooch turns up broken, and now the earrings are gone altogether." Earrings. Miss Marple needed no further prompting to connect them with the brooch Mrs. Edgeworth had received on her wedding day, the ones Miss Wren had mentioned as part of a set. She made her purchase quickly and walked directly toward Foxglove House. Mrs. Finch answered the door, her usual composure more brittle than ever. "You've heard already, I suppose. Bad news travels as fast as good pie at a parish supper. Madam is in her room, most upset." Miss Marple expressed the proper sympathy and was shown to Mrs. Edgeworth's sitting room, where the widow sat in an armchair, a silk shawl drawn around her shoulders. "They were in the top drawer of my dressing table," she said, her voice trembling. "I looked this morning and they were gone. The drawer was not locked, perhaps foolish of me, but the house has been quiet since the fete. Only the regular staff and Gerald, of course." Miss Marple noted the order of those last words and the faint hesitation before Gerald's name. "Have you noticed anything else amiss?" she asked gently. Mrs. Edgeworth shook her head. "Nothing. But I cannot help thinking it is connected. The brooch comes back damaged, and now the earrings are gone. It is as though someone is dismantling my wedding gift piece by piece." When Miss Marple left the house, Gerald himself was coming up the drive, cigarette in hand. He stopped when he saw her. "You've heard, I suppose. This will only feed the village chatter. My aunt thinks I've brought trouble with me." "Perhaps she's right. Perhaps trouble was here already," Miss Marple said mildly. "It has a way of settling in before anyone notices." Gerald gave a humorless smile. "If you learn who took them, do let me know. I might even shake their hand for ridding us of that cursed jewelry." She watched him walk on, noting the restless energy in his stride. Whether it was guilt, frustration, or something else entirely remained to be seen. That afternoon, Inspector Craddock came to the cottage, clearly in no mood for small talk. "Another theft," he said without preamble. The earrings from the Edgeworth set. No signs of forced entry, no strangers seen near the house. Miss Marple poured tea for them both. "What if," she suggested, "the earrings were not taken for their value at all?" Craddock frowned. "Then why?" "To remove them from the set, of course," Miss Marple replied. "A set is worth more together. If the brooch is broken, the set's value drops, unless the rest is kept from being sold or examined." Craddock stirred his tea absently. "Meaning the person taking them wants to make sure the jewelry can't be used for something like proving ownership, perhaps? Or proving a connection," Miss Marple said. "Jewelry often carries history along with it. Sometimes history is more dangerous than money." They were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Millie Parsons again, looking pale. "I thought you should know," she said to Miss Marple. "I saw something last night." I was walking home from my cousin's when I passed the bandstand. There was someone there, Mrs. Price Ridley. She was meeting with a man I didn't recognize. They were talking in low voices. When they saw me, they moved away quickly. Miss Marple thanked her and sent her home with a biscuit. Once she was gone, Craddock leaned forward. "This is the second time Mrs. Price Ridley's name has come up in connection with suspicious behavior," he said. "If she's mixed up in the brooch and the earrings, we may be closer than I thought." Miss Marple set her cup down. Perhaps she's closer to the truth than she realizes, and someone wishes her to be suspected. That evening, Miss Marple took a quiet walk through the village. The light was fading, and the air carried the cool promise of night. As she approached the green, she saw Mrs. Price Ridley herself, hurrying from the direction of the bandstand, a scarf pulled tight around her head. Miss Marple did not call out, but she made a mental note. The next day brought a small but intriguing discovery. Craddock had ordered a search of the vestry, on the grounds that several key people had been seen going in and out during the fete. Tucked behind a stack of hymnals, they found a small paper parcel. Inside was a single lemon, slightly shriveled, its skin pierced by a tiny pinprick. Miss Marple examined it at the station. "A hollow for a drop of liquid," she said. "Quite enough to poison a cup of tea if one wished." Craddock nodded grimly. "We'll have it tested. But if this was used, it means the poison was in the lemon slice itself, not the tea or sugar." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "And who was serving the lemon that day?" "The vicar's wife," Craddock said, "and Mrs. Edgeworth, for a short while the vicar's wife fetched more cups." Miss Marple sat back. A pattern was emerging, faint but distinct. The brooch in the sugar bowl, the clink of unused tongs, and the lemon slice handed to the victim were each small acts that seemed innocent alone, but together suggested a deliberate sequence. And now, with the earrings gone, the sequence had taken another step. That evening, as the village settled into lamplight and the last post clattered into the letterbox, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting needles still. She thought of the person who had placed the brooch in the chipped sugar bowl, not to hide it entirely, but to ensure it was found at the right moment. She thought of the hand that had chosen one particular lemon for Mr. Larch's tea, and she thought of the missing earrings, whose absence might be as telling as their presence. In her experience, such precision belonged not to chance, but to someone who understood timing, someone who knew exactly when a small diversion could hide a deadly act. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, that person was watching the rest of the village speculate, perhaps even smiling at how well their plan had gone so far. Miss Marple, however, was not smiling. She knew the game was still in motion, and the next move, she feared, would not be the last. By the next morning, St. Mary Mead felt like a room that had been tidied too quickly, everything in place on the surface, but with dust still lurking underneath. The news of the missing earrings had set the village whispering afresh, and though faces remained politely composed, the eyes of the villagers roved more often, measuring one another. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat in her small sitting room, the lace curtains drawn just enough to give her a view of the lane. Her knitting lay idle in her lap. The events of the past week had resolved themselves in her mind into a series of deliberate moves, each quiet, each easy to overlook, yet all of them pointed toward one person. It was not enough to know in her heart who had done it. Proof, even of a kind suitable for Inspector Craddock's practical mind, would be needed. Proof, she had learned long ago, was often best obtained by watching how someone behaved when they thought they were not being tested. And so she began to plan a small, harmless snare to see if her suspicion would confirm itself. She started by visiting Mrs. Edgeworth under the guise of inquiring after her health. The widow was pale but composed and seemed oddly distracted, as if her thoughts were elsewhere. Miss Marple made tea, uninvited but politely, and during the process she spoke of the earrings. "I imagine you must feel quite bereft," Miss Marple said gently, stirring her cup. "A set is like a family. It feels incomplete when one part is missing." Mrs. Edgeworth gave a tight smile. "I never much liked the set. My husband chose it. He had very fixed ideas." "Still," Miss Marple murmured, "there are those who might wish to see it whole again. Sometimes a person's attachment to an object is not their own, but inherited." Mrs. Edgeworth said nothing, but her gloved hands tightened slightly on her teacup. The second call Miss Marple made that day was to Mrs. Price Ridley. She took with her a small parcel wrapped in brown paper, explaining it contained a church matter she wished to return. Inside was nothing more than a chipped saucer, but the parcel was meant to resemble the one Milly had described seeing before the fete. Miss Marple set it on the table between them and spoke of other things, watching how Mrs. Price Ridley's eyes returned to it, her lips pressing tighter each time. When Miss Marple left, she stopped briefly at the post office to exchange a few words with Miss Wren. She asked her to mention casually and without emphasis that a certain valuable clue had been found in a small package left at the vestry. It was not true, but Miss Marple knew the villagers' gift for swift transmission would carry it to the right ears before supper. That evening, she invited Inspector Craddock to her cottage for tea. She told him she wished to stage a brief gathering the following afternoon at the vicarage under the pretense of discussing arrangements for the harvest fair. She asked him to ensure that Mrs. Edgeworth, Gerald, Mrs. Price Ridley, and Milly Parsons were all present. "And what exactly am I to be watching for?" Craddock asked, his tone curious. "Not what they say," Inspector Miss Marple said with a smile. "What they do when they think no one is looking. Words are easy to choose, and gestures are not." The next day, the vicarage drawing-room filled with polite chatter and the faint scent of beeswax polish. Mrs. Clement busied herself with the tea service while Miss Marple sat quietly in the corner, her hands folded. She let the conversation drift aimlessly about the harvest fair, the weather, and a rumor about a visiting clergyman. At a lull, Miss Marple mentioned that the police had made an interesting discovery in connection with the fete. She did not elaborate, merely sipped her tea. The effect was immediate. Gerald shifted in his seat, Mrs. Price Ridley's eyes narrowed, and Mrs. Edgeworth's gloved fingers began to drum lightly against her cup. Milly looked between them with the apprehension of someone waiting for a storm to break. Miss Marple allowed the silence to stretch just long enough, then set down her cup and remarked, as if in passing, "It's remarkable how something as small as a sugar bowl can be the key to a mystery." It was then she saw the faintest flicker of reaction in Mrs. Edgeworth's eyes, followed by the swift lowering of her gaze. Not fear, but calculation, as though she were running through the consequences of something remembered. Mrs. Price Ridley, by contrast, looked confused, and Gerald merely scoffed. After the meeting broke up, Miss Marple lingered, helping Mrs. Clement clear the cups. She spoke softly to Craddock, who had stayed behind. "It's her," Miss Marple said simply. "Mrs. Edgeworth." She cannot help herself. When the sugar bowl was mentioned, she looked for the exit before she looked at anyone else. That is the instinct of someone who fears being found out. Craddock still frowned. But why the brooch? Why the earrings? And why kill Larch? Miss Marple shook her head slightly. The brooch was the bait, the earrings the cover, and the lemon the means. As for the why, I believe that will be clearer once you search her late husband's papers. Later that evening, Miss Marple took a slow walk through the village. The air was cooling, the shadows lengthening. She passed the bandstand, its wooden steps creaking under her foot as she paused there. She imagined Mr. Larch waiting in the fading light, holding an envelope with a pressed flower, expecting a conversation that would never happen. She imagined the quiet arrival of someone who knew exactly how to smile, exactly how to make the meeting seem innocent to anyone passing by. She thought of the brooch placed in the sugar bowl, not to hide it forever, but to cause a scene at a particular time. That moment of discovery had drawn every eye at the fete, leaving only a few unnoticed seconds in which a lemon slice could be chosen, pierced, and slipped into a cup. Precision, planning, and the confidence to do it all, under the gaze of a village. By the time Miss Marple returned to her cottage, she had decided what must happen next. The test had confirmed her suspicion. All that remained was to ensure that when the truth came out, it would be clear to everyone not only who had done it, but also how. The next morning, she sent a note to Inspector Craddock, asking him to call at once. She also wrote 2 other short notes, each with a single sentence, to be delivered by hand to Mrs. Edgeworth and Mrs. Price Ridley. The sentence was simple. "The sugar bowl will be discussed this afternoon." She smiled faintly as she sealed the envelopes. It was not cruelty. It was clarity. People often revealed themselves most clearly when they believed a final confrontation was near, and Miss Marple intended to be watching every movement when that moment arrived. The day of the final gathering dawned clear and still, the sort of weather that seemed almost too calm for the undercurrents running beneath it. Miss Marple took her tea early, her mind already arranging the pieces into their final pattern. By the afternoon, the vicarage drawing-room had chairs in a neat semicircle, tea and seed cake on a side table, and Inspector Craddock in a position where he could see every face. They came, one by one, each bringing their own brand of composure. Mrs. Edgeworth, elegant as ever, her gloves immaculate, sat near the window. Gerald lounged in a chair opposite, his expression bored but his eyes quick. Mrs. Price Ridley settled herself primly, back straight, handbag clasped on her lap. Millie Parsons slipped in quietly, looking as if she'd rather be anywhere else. Miss Marple began not with an accusation but with a story. She spoke in a gentle, conversational tone, as though she were reminiscing about a long-ago village fete. She described how such events had a rhythm. The stalls busy in the morning, the tea tent most crowded in mid-afternoon, and the lull when attention was divided between the raffle and the final rounds of the tombola. It was during just such a lull, she continued, that 2 things happened almost at once. A brooch was discovered in a chipped sugar bowl at the White Elephant stall, and Mr. Larch was served a cup of tea with lemon. Both events seemed separate, but they were not. The first was meant to cause a stir, to make every head turn. The second was meant to pass unnoticed. Mrs. Edgeworth's gaze remained on the lace curtain beside her, but her gloved fingers moved faintly against the arm of her chair. Gerald frowned, shifting slightly, while Mrs. Price Ridley's brows drew together. Miss Marple went on, her voice still mild. "It is a clever thing, a distraction. A scene at one end of the green, and at the other hand, free to choose one particular lemon slice from the tray, one that had been prepared in advance with a drop of cyanide. That slice went into Mr. Larch's cup. He took no sugar, so there was no risk of stirring it away." Inspector Craddock's eyes swept the room. No one spoke. "And the brooch," Miss Marple continued, "was not simply returned. It was broken first to ensure it could not easily be restored to the set of which it was once part. That set included a pair of earrings, which, as we know, have since gone missing. Taken, I believe, not for their value, but to prevent the set from being sold or perhaps recognized." Millie shifted uncomfortably. "Recognized?" she echoed. "Yes, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "Recognized by someone who knew it well. Jewelry, especially a wedding gift, can carry with it the memory of where it came from. And in this case, it was tied to a matter Mr. Larch had recently been asked to look into, a matter of inheritance that could have proved awkward." Mrs. Price Ridley gave a small gasp. "You don't mean?" Miss Marple held up a hand. Mr. Larch had been inquiring into the provenance of certain items belonging to Mrs. Edgeworth. I believe he was close to discovering that the set brooch and earrings were not originally hers, but had come into her possession under questionable circumstances many years ago, circumstances that, if revealed, would have caused her considerable embarrassment. All eyes turned to Mrs. Edgeworth. She lifted her chin. "This is absurd. You are weaving fancies from coincidence." "No," Miss Marple said gently, "from behavior. On the day of the fete, you assisted in the tea tent for a short time, serving lemon while the vicar's wife fetched more cups. You knew Mr. Larch took lemon, and you knew he would be distracted when the brooch was found. You had already placed it in the sugar bowl earlier that morning, wrapped so it would not be discovered until the right moment. And when I mentioned the sugar bowl in passing 2 days ago, your instinct was not to ask why, but to look for the door." Mrs. Edgeworth's face remained composed, but there was the faintest tremor at the corner of her mouth. "As for the earrings," Miss Marple continued, "you removed them after the brooch's discovery to make certain the set could never be reassembled. Perhaps you fear that in reuniting the pieces, their history would be examined. And perhaps you feared that history would lead back to the man you married and to how he acquired them." Gerald leaned forward. "So you're saying, my aunt—" "I am saying," Miss Marple replied, "that when one wishes to conceal a truth, it is often easier to remove every trace of it than to defend it. The brooch was the lure, the lemon the weapon, and the earrings the insurance. Each step was calculated." Inspector Craddock cleared his throat. "Mrs. Edgeworth, would you care to respond?" For a long moment, Mrs. Edgeworth said nothing. Then she gave a small, almost imperceptible sigh. "Mr. Larch was going to ruin me," she said, her voice low. "Not with the law, but with whispers. He had found out things about my husband's past, things I had endured for years in silence. I could not have them dragged out for the amusement of the village." Craddock's expression was grave. "So you chose to silence him permanently?" Mrs. Edgeworth's gaze flicked toward Miss Marple. "I suppose you think it was all so obvious?" Miss Marple shook her head. "No, my dear. It was subtle and well planned. But in villages, we notice the smallest things, like how a person holds a cup, how they react to a word, or whether they look toward the exit when they feel the walls closing in. You relied on distraction, but in doing so, you showed me where to look." There was a silence then, broken only by the faint ticking of the vicarage clock. Mrs. Edgeworth's gloves rested limply in her lap, her posture no longer so rigid. Gerald sat back heavily, eyes fixed on the carpet. Mrs. Price Ridley clutched her handbag tighter, perhaps relieved to find the finger of suspicion turning away from her. At last, Craddock rose. "Mrs. Edgeworth, I'm afraid I must ask you to come with me." She stood slowly, her eyes on Miss Marple. "You have a talent for seeing what others miss," she said quietly. "I hope you're proud of it." Miss Marple's expression was gentle, almost sorrowful. "It is not a matter of pride, only by seeing people as they are." When they were gone, the room seemed to exhale. Milly looked at Miss Marple with something like awe. "You knew all along?" "No," Miss Marple said, reaching for her knitting bag. "I only suspected. Knowing comes when the pattern is complete." She settled her needles in her hands, the faint click of them filling the quiet. Outside, the late afternoon sun slanted across the green, touching the bandstand with gold. Life in St. Mary Mead would return to its usual rhythms soon enough, but for now, the village would speak in softer voices, with an air of having witnessed something unsettling. Miss Marple had no illusions about that. In her experience, even the most peaceful places could hold the darkest intentions if one only knew where to look. The day after Mrs. Edgeworth's arrest dawned with a muted, almost apologetic light, as though the village itself was aware of the disruption to its peace. The usual rhythms of St. Mary Mead persisted, with milk delivered, shop doors opening, and church bells marking the hour, but each sound carried an undercurrent, as if wrapped in quiet speculation. For all the polite nods exchanged in the street, people's thoughts were elsewhere. Miss Marple, who had seen many such mornings after the scandal, understood the atmosphere well. A crime in the village never ended simply with an arrest. It lingered, seeping into conversations, shaping how neighbors saw each other. She took her tea by the window, watching as Mrs. Bantry crossed the green with deliberate purpose, no doubt to begin her own round of discreet information gathering. Inspector Craddock stopped by mid-morning. He looked as though he had slept little, but his manner was steady. Miss Marple showed him in and poured coffee, which he accepted gratefully. "The evidence will hold," he said, setting his cup down. The missing earrings were found in a sewing box in Mrs. Edgeworth's wardrobe, and the jeweler in Market Chipping remembers her asking if a broken brooch could be recut to disguise the damage. As for the lemon, the laboratory confirmed cyanide. Miss Marple nodded. It was the precision of the timing that told me she had planned it long before the day itself. She needed a distraction at exactly the right moment. Craddock leaned back. She claims she acted alone, that Gerald knew nothing. I'm inclined to believe her. He's many things, but subtle is not one of them. That was my impression as well, Miss Marple said. He's restless, not calculating. The sort to make noise, not quiet moves. Craddock hesitated. Do you think she regrets it? Miss Marple looked out toward the green. Perhaps. But regret after the fact is a different thing from reluctance beforehand. She had decided her course before the fete began. Once a person resolves upon such an action, they rarely turn back. After Craddock left, Miss Marple went about her day quietly. At the grocer's, she noticed the conversations pausing when she entered, then resuming in a softer tone. At the post office, Miss Wren inquired under the pretext of asking after the weather whether the case was truly settled. Even the vicar's wife, delivering a basket of scones to a neighbor, could not resist asking, "Do you think she will be forgiven?" Forgiveness, Miss Marple knew, was a complicated matter in a place like St. Mary Mead. Time would soften the edges, perhaps even bring a kind of sympathy, but not without leaving a faint shadow. In the afternoon, Millie Parsons came to the cottage. She still looked troubled. "I keep thinking about the brooch," Millie said. "If I hadn't found it, I'd have just left that box alone." "Maybe Mr. Larch." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "My dear, the plan did not depend on you. Whoever placed that brooch there meant for it to be discovered. If you hadn't found it, someone else would have." Millie seemed comforted, though not entirely at ease. She lingered a while, speaking of ordinary things, before going on her way. As evening approached, Miss Marple walked to the churchyard. The roses there were in late bloom, and she paused to admire them before sitting on a bench. From this vantage point, she could see both the vicarage and the green. The village appeared peaceful again, but she knew it was only on the surface. People would carry the memory of the fete for years, the sudden death, the broken brooch, and the quiet revelation of who had done it. Her mind turned briefly to Mr. Larch. He had been, by all accounts, a competent solicitor and perhaps a lonely man. His death had been planned with precision, yet carried out in the midst of bunting and laughter. That, Miss Marple thought, was the unsettling part, how easily such a deed could hide among ordinary events. She stayed until the shadows lengthened, then made her way home. In her parlor, she picked up her knitting. The pattern was familiar, one she had worked many times before, but she found herself thinking of it differently, each stitch like a small piece of the puzzle, meaningless alone, essential in the whole. The next day, life began its slow return to normal. Gerald left the village early, without ceremony. Mrs. Price Ridley resumed her post in the church vestry, though with noticeably less inclination to linger after services. Millie was back at the post office, her voice bright again when customers came in. And yet, whenever the fete was mentioned, a certain quiet would fall before the talk moved on. Miss Marple's visitors that week included Dr. Haydock, who stopped by to check on her general health and ended up staying for tea. "You have a way of seeing through people," he remarked. "I don't know how you do it." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It isn't a matter of cleverness. People give themselves away constantly. They believe they are being careful, but their habits and their small reactions speak as clearly as words. And Mrs. Edgeworth? She wanted control, Doctor. Over her reputation, over what was remembered and what was forgotten. In the end, that desire was stronger than her fear. Dr. Haydock nodded slowly. I suppose the rest of us just go on, then. That's what villagers do, Miss Marple said. They go on. Later, alone, she reflected on that truth. St. Mary Mead would absorb this scandal as it had others before it, tucking it into the folds of its history. New gossip would come, new events to occupy minds and conversations. But beneath it all, there would remain the faint outline of what had happened at the fete, like the impression left by a brooch on the velvet of its box. Miss Marple rose, drew the curtains against the fading light, and set her knitting aside. There was a certain peace in knowing the matter was concluded, but also a certain melancholy. Human nature, she thought, did not change. There would always be another puzzle, another moment when a small observation would open the way to understanding something much larger. For now, though, the village was quiet, and in that quiet she found herself content to let the needles click softly in her hands, the pattern unfolding stitch by stitch, just as life in St. Mary Mead unfolded steady, familiar, and, for the moment at least, untroubled.